Hey, tonight we begin with something light and relaxing. Just the near total extinction of the human species. So go ahead and dim the lights, maybe adjust your pillow, let your shoulders drop a little, because for the next while we're going to drift back, way back, to a time before kings, before castles, before anyone complained about taxes. We're heading to nearly 900,000 years ago, which is so long ago that even your most historically dramatic medieval monarch would look at it and say, yeah, that's a bit much. And somewhere in that deep ancient stretch of time, something happened, something slow, something quiet, something that reduced the human population to a number so small it feels almost like a typo. Roughly 1200 breeding individuals. Not 1200 million, not 1200 tribes, just about 1200 individuals capable of having children. Which means, yes, at one point your entire family tree, mine too, could have fit inside a moderately crowded sports arena, and nobody even noticed. There were no dramatic trumpets, no collapsing empires, no royal proclamations, just a long, grinding environmental shift that nearly erased us from the planet. Let's gently wander into that world. About 900,000 years ago, the Earth was going through a bit of a mood swing. And by mood swing, I mean dramatic glacial cycles, unstable climates, and environmental chaos that made modern weather complaints seem adorable. This was the early Pleistocene. Ice sheets were expanding, temperatures were dropping, rainfall patterns were shifting, entire ecosystems were transforming. Forests shrank, grasslands shifted, water sources dried up, and somewhere in Africa, because yes, we are still very much in Africa at this point, early human ancestors were trying to survive all of this without central heating. The species most researchers associate with this period is Homo erectus. Now, Homo erectus was not you, not quite, but also kind of you. They walked upright, they used tools, they controlled fire, probably. They had larger brains than earlier hominins. They were, in many ways, humanity's ambitious middle manager phase. And for a long time, they were thriving. Homo erectus spread across Africa and into Eurasia. They adapted to different climates. They survived for over 1,000,000 years, which frankly is a longer run than most dynasties ever managed. But around 900,000 years ago, something changed. Genetic research conducted in recent years suggests that the ancestral human population went through what's called a severe population bottleneck. Now, bottleneck sounds kind of cute, like something you'd use to describe traffic, but in biology, it means a drastic reduction in population size. Imagine humanity as a wide river. Now imagine squeezing that river through a narrow pipe. That's a bottleneck. For about 100,000 years, yes, 100,000, the effective breeding population of early humans appears to have dropped to around 1,200 individuals, and it stayed that low. Not for a generation, not for a bad season, for tens of thousands of years, which is not ideal. Let's just pause on that. For perspective, 100,000 years from today, modern humans hadn't even fully spread across the globe yet. Civilization was nowhere in sight. Agriculture, not even a rumor. And here we are talking about something 9 times older than that. This bottleneck is believed to have lasted roughly from 930,000 to 813,000 years ago. So what caused it? Well, Earth was entering a period of intensified glaciation. The climate cycles shifted from relatively mild oscillations to longer, harsher ice ages. Colder temperatures meant expanding ice sheets. Expanding ice sheets meant lower sea levels and disrupted ecosystems. Rainfall patterns changed dramatically in Africa. And if you are an early human dependent on predictable food sources, that's not great. Imagine relying on migrating animals that suddenly don't migrate the same way anymore. Imagine fruit trees that no longer bear fruit because rainfall collapsed.
Early humans were adaptable, but they were not immune to environmental collapse. And unlike later humans, they didn't have agriculture, trade networks, or the ability to order emergency supplies from 3 continents away. They had stone tools, fire, maybe, and each other. As climates cooled and dried, populations would have become fragmented. Small groups isolated from one another. Some likely starved. Some failed to reproduce enough. Some simply vanished. Not dramatically, just gradually. One small group at a time. And because populations were already scattered across large territories, once numbers dropped, recovery wasn't quick. When you have only about 1,200 breeding individuals across an entire continent, or perhaps several, genetic diversity becomes dangerously low. Which means every child born is closely related to everyone else. Yes, we are back in familiar territory. Humanity itself became the ultimate tiny, awkward royal family. Except without crowns. Low genetic diversity increases vulnerability to disease. It reduces adaptability. It makes populations fragile. And for roughly 100,000 years, our ancestors lived in that fragile state. It's almost strangely poetic. Later in history, kings and queens would obsess over preserving pure bloodlines. Meanwhile, the entire species once had no choice. Everyone was distant cousins, because there was no one else. Let's gently drift into what daily life might have looked like. Picture open savanna punctuated by dry grass and scattered trees. Long dry seasons, waterholes shrinking. Small bands of perhaps 20 to 40 individuals. They would have moved constantly, following food sources. They used Acheulean tools, those symmetrical hand axes that look oddly elegant for something made nearly 1,000,000 years ago. And despite the environmental hardship, they survived. That's the part that's easy to forget. Yes, 99% of the population may have been wiped out, but not 100%. Some groups endured. Maybe they were in slightly more stable ecological pockets. Maybe they were particularly good at cooperation. Maybe they just got lucky. Evolution does not always reward the strongest. Sometimes it rewards the simply not unfortunate. Over time, climates shifted again. Ice ages waxed and waned. Rainfall patterns stabilized. Habitats recovered. And slowly, very slowly, human populations began to expand once more. From roughly 1,200 breeding individuals, numbers began creeping upward. It wasn't explosive growth. There were no baby booms. Just gradual recovery across millennia. And from that tiny genetic pool emerged every human who would ever live. Every empire builder, every poet, every awkward teenager, every king who thought marrying his cousin was a brilliant political strategy. All of them trace back through that narrow evolutionary funnel. It's almost comforting in a strange way. All of human drama, all of our wars and art and gossip and spreadsheets, and it nearly ended before it began.
Now here's where it gets even more quietly fascinating. This bottleneck may have played a role in shaping later human evolution. Some researchers suggest that the stress of environmental change could have driven evolutionary shifts. Brain size increased over time. Tool use became more sophisticated. Eventually, new human species would emerge. One of them, hundreds of thousands of years later, would be Homo sapiens. That's us. Technically speaking, though some mornings perhaps debatably. But the key point is this. Without that small surviving population, there would be no Homo sapiens, no cities, no history channels, no bedtime YouTube videos. Just an empty branch on the evolutionary tree. And here's something softly ironic. While later human civilizations would collapse due to wars, political incompetence, or elaborate palace intrigue, our species nearly vanished because of climate instability. Nature doesn't need scandal. It just needs time. And patience. And a little bit of ice. So as you lie there, maybe drifting closer to sleep, consider this. Every breath you take tonight is the result of an unbroken chain stretching back nearly 1,000,000 years. Through drought. Through cold. Through isolation. Through near extinction. It's not dramatic. It's not glamorous. It's just persistent. Humanity survived not because it was invincible, but because a small number of individuals, about 1,200 of them, endured long enough to have children. And those children had children. And so on. For 900,000 years. We'll slowly continue from here next time, drifting further into how later bottlenecks shaped human evolution, and how close we came again and again to quietly disappearing. But for now, let's just rest in that ancient resilience. Because if our ancestors could survive 100,000 years of environmental collapse with stone tools, you can probably survive tomorrow's emails. Sleep well.
All right, let's gently drift back. The lights are low. The world is quiet. And we are still 900,000 years in the past, standing on a windy stretch of African grassland with about 1,199 other extremely important people. No pressure. In part 1, we floated through the idea that humanity shrunk to roughly 1,200 breeding individuals during a severe population bottleneck. Now, let's ease into the slow grinding force behind it. Climate. Not dramatic lightning bolts, not volcanoes exploding every Tuesday, just long, stubborn cold. During the early Pleistocene, Earth's climate cycles began to shift in a way that scientists sometimes refer to as the mid-Pleistocene transition, which sounds very official and very calm, like Earth filled out some paperwork and changed departments. But what it really meant was this: glacial cycles became longer and harsher. Instead of relatively short cold snaps, ice ages started lasting around 100,000 years at a time. That is an aggressively long winter. Massive ice sheets expanded across the northern hemisphere. Sea levels dropped. Global weather patterns shifted. Rainfall in Africa became far less predictable. And if you are an early human depending on stable ecosystems, this is inconvenient. The species navigating this was most likely Homo erectus, our durable, long-lived ancestor who had already survived for hundreds of thousands of years. Homo erectus was not fragile. They had larger brains than earlier hominins. They made Acheulean hand axes with surprising symmetry. They may have controlled fire. they spread across vast territories. They were doing reasonably well until the climate decided to make everything complicated. As temperatures dropped and rainfall patterns changed, African environments became patchy. Forested areas shrunk, lakes dried up, grasslands expanded in some places and vanished in others. Food became unpredictable. And early humans were hunter-gatherers without grocery stores, refrigeration, or long-term storage strategies beyond hope the next valley has something edible. Small bands would have been forced to migrate constantly, searching, adapting, competing. Now here's where it gets quietly serious. When populations become fragmented due to environmental change, groups get isolated, and isolated groups are vulnerable. If a small band loses too many members from starvation, disease, or simply failure to reproduce, it doesn't make headlines. It just fades. Multiply that process across thousands of years and you get a slow motion collapse. No single catastrophic event, just attrition. And genetic evidence suggests that's exactly what happened. The ancestral population shrank and stayed small for roughly 100,000 years. Imagine generation after generation growing up in tiny, scattered communities, each group perhaps unaware of how few humans remained elsewhere. They weren't thinking, we are the last of our kind. They were thinking, is there water over that hill? Survival at that scale becomes intensely local. What's fascinating is that despite such small numbers, humans did not lose critical cognitive capacity. In fact, some researchers believe that environmental pressure may have encouraged innovation. When resources are scarce, cooperation becomes essential. Sharing food, coordinating hunts, protecting children. Social bonds likely grew stronger. Communication may have become more complex. Planning became vital. You cannot afford chaos when your entire species fits inside a small regional population. There's something almost ironic about it. Later human history would be full of overconfident empires collapsing from internal drama. Meanwhile, during this bottleneck, survival probably depended on calm collaboration and quiet adaptability. No thrones, no crowns, just teamwork. Over tens of thousands of years, climate patterns eventually began to stabilize. Glacial cycles continued, but ecosystems adjusted. And slowly, human populations expanded again. It was not a dramatic explosion. No celebratory moment where someone declared, "We are back, baby." Just gradual growth. More surviving children, more interconnected groups, slightly increasing genetic diversity. And from that small ancestral pool, later human species would eventually emerge. One of them, much later, would be Homo sapiens. Now, Homo sapiens did not appear immediately after this bottleneck. Evolution does not rush. It strolls, it takes notes, it revises drafts. But the genetic narrowing that occurred during this period may have shaped the trajectory of human development. Low genetic diversity can sound alarming, and it is, but it also means that future variation arises from a very small base. All modern humans today are remarkably genetically similar compared to many other species. That similarity may partly trace back to this ancient contraction. In other words, the reason humanity today shares so much genetic DNA across continents could be linked to this moment when almost everyone disappeared. It's oddly intimate. Every person alive today is connected not just by shared ancestry in a general sense, but by this specific narrow point in deep time. A funnel. A survival corridor. And what's especially humbling is how quiet it all was. There were no monuments marking the recovery. No inscriptions carved into stone saying, "Congratulations on not going extinct." Just slow adaptation. Stone tools continued evolving. Hunting strategies improved. Migration routes expanded. And the story kept going. But let's linger just a little longer in that fragile window. Picture a small group at dusk. Wind across tall grass. A fire flickering perhaps. Children huddled near adults. They have no idea that they are the thin thread holding the future together. They are simply surviving the season.
And somehow, that was enough. There's a quiet lesson in that. Survival does not always look heroic. It often looks ordinary. Repetitive, slow. Find food, protect the group, raise the young, repeat. For 100,000 years. And through that persistence, humanity made it through one of the most extreme population reductions in its entire history. Not the last time we would face danger. Not the last bottleneck. But one of the earliest and most profound. So as we gently close part 2, let your mind rest on that image. A small band of early humans under a vast sky. Unaware of genetics. Unaware of ice age cycles. Unaware that nearly 99% of their kind had vanished. They simply continued. Step by step. Generation by generation. And because they did, you're here. Comfortable. Listening. Breathing easily in a world that once came very close to having no one left to breathe at all. Next time, we'll drift further forward. Towards the later bottlenecks, the rise of new human species. And the strangely repeated pattern of almost disappearing. And somehow not. For now, just let the ancient wind fade into silence.
All right, settle back in. Maybe you've shifted to the cooler side of the pillow. Maybe the room is completely still now. We've survived one near extinction already tonight, which feels productive. We lingered in that deep, ancient bottleneck nearly 900,000 years ago, when early humans, likely descendants of Homo erectus, were reduced to roughly 1,200 breeding individuals. An entire species balanced on the biological equivalent of a thin branch. And yet, that was not the only time humanity flirted with disappearance. Because evolution, apparently, enjoys suspense. Let's gently float forward through time. Hundreds of thousands of years pass. Glacial cycles continue their slow rhythm. Human populations expand and contract with shifting climates. New human species appear. Among them, eventually, is Homo sapiens. That's us. Emerging in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had larger brains, more complex tools, and increasingly sophisticated social behavior. But being clever does not make you invincible. Around 70,000 to 75,000 years ago, Earth experienced another event that may have dramatically reduced human populations. This time, it wasn't just climate cycles, it was a volcano. Specifically, the eruption of Lake Toba, located in present-day Indonesia. Now, when we say eruption, we are not talking about a mildly inconvenient ash cloud that disrupts flights for a few days. We are talking about one of the largest volcanic events in the last 2 million years. The eruption of Lake Toba released enormous amounts of ash into the atmosphere. Some estimates suggest it may have triggered a volcanic winter, a period of global cooling caused by sunlight-blocking particles in the air. Temperatures could have dropped significantly. Ecosystems would have been stressed, food chains disrupted. For small hunter-gatherer populations already living close to environmental limits, this was not ideal. There is debate among scientists about just how severe the human population impact was. Some argue that modern humans were reduced to perhaps a few thousand individuals. Others suggest the effect may not have been as catastrophic as once believed. But genetic data indicates that sometime between about 50,000 and 100,000 years ago, human populations experienced another bottleneck. Not as extreme as the 900,000-year-old one, but still sobering. Imagine again small, scattered groups. This time, they are fully modern humans. They have language. They create symbolic objects. They likely tell stories around fires. And suddenly,
ash darkens the sky, vegetation declines, game animals shift territories, water sources change, and once again, survival becomes intensely local. What's quietly remarkable is that despite these repeated squeezes in our evolutionary timeline, humanity persisted. Some groups remained in Africa, others began migrating outward. Around 60 to 70,000 years ago, small bands of Homo sapiens began leaving Africa and moving into the Middle East, then into Asia, Europe, and eventually Australia. It wasn't a grand march. It was gradual, a few families at a time, step by step along coastlines and river valleys. And here's something gently ironic. The descendants of those few migrating groups would eventually populate the entire planet. Every skyscraper, every kingdom, every mildly chaotic family reunion, all tracing back to small bands navigating uncertain climates with stone tools and determination. Now, during these migrations, humans encountered other hominin species, most famously the Neanderthal. The Neanderthal lived across Europe and parts of Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. They were robust, adapted to cold climates, capable tool makers, and yes, we interbred with them, which means that many people alive today carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA, a quiet reminder that extinction is not always clean-cut. Sometimes species fade gradually, blending into others. By around 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthal disappeared. Climate changes likely played a role, competition may have mattered, but again, it was not a dramatic final battle, just slow decline. Which brings us to an oddly consistent theme in human survival. We rarely face extinction through sudden cinematic explosions. Instead, the danger comes from long-term environmental pressure. Slow cooling, darkened sky, food resources become scarce, small groups band together. Survival becomes intensely local. What's quietly remarkable is that despite these repeated squeezes in our evolutionary timeline, humanity persisted. Some groups remained in Africa, others began migrating outward. Around 60 to 70,000 years ago, small bands of Homo sapiens began leaving Africa and moving into the Middle East, then into Asia, Europe, and eventually Australia. It wasn't a grand march. It was gradual, a few families at a time, step by step along coastlines and river valleys. And here's something gently ironic. The descendants of those few migrating groups would eventually populate the entire planet. Every skyscraper, every kingdom, every mildly chaotic family reunion, all tracing back to small bands navigating uncertain climates with stone tools and determination. Now, during these migrations, humans encountered other hominin species, most famously the Neanderthal. The Neanderthal lived across Europe and parts of Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. They were robust, adapted to cold climates, capable tool makers, and yes, we interbred with them, which means that many people alive today carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA, a quiet reminder that extinction is not always clean-cut. Sometimes species fade gradually, blending into others. By around 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthal disappeared. Climate changes likely played a role, competition may have mattered, but again, it was not a dramatic final battle, just slow decline. Which brings us to an oddly consistent theme in human survival. We rarely face extinction through sudden cinematic explosions. Instead, the danger comes from long-term environmental pressure. Slow cooling, darkened sky, food resources become scarce, small groups band together. Survival becomes intensely local. What's quietly remarkable is that despite these repeated squeezes in our evolutionary timeline, humanity persisted. Some groups remained in Africa, others began migrating outward. Around 60 to 70,000 years ago, small bands of Homo sapiens began leaving Africa and moving into the Middle East, then into Asia, Europe, and eventually Australia. It wasn't a grand march. It was gradual, a few families at a time, step by step along coastlines and river valleys. And here's something gently ironic. The descendants of those few migrating groups would eventually populate the entire planet. Every skyscraper, every kingdom, every mildly chaotic family reunion, all tracing back to small bands navigating uncertain climates with stone tools and determination. Now, during these migrations, humans encountered other hominin species, most famously the Neanderthal. The Neanderthal lived across Europe and parts of Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. They were robust, adapted to cold climates, capable tool makers, and yes, we interbred with them, which means that many people alive today carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA, a quiet reminder that extinction is not always clean-cut. Sometimes species fade gradually, blending into others. By around 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthal disappeared. Climate changes likely played a role, competition may have mattered, but again, it was not a dramatic final battle, just slow decline. Which brings us to an oddly consistent theme in human survival. We rarely face extinction